Hello again everyone, this video is back again with yet another middle game series, this time on how to sacrifice a piece, and hence destroying your opponent's armor and render them naked a little bit. But unlike usual, it's not very easy to find any pattern or cue to confidently say that sacrifice is right. It does seem like it's going to need a lot of calculation and above all, intuition. You might hear a lot from this famous players such as Kasparov and also Hikaru Nakamura. The intuition is also an important part of the game, but obviously alongside that as well, is going to be a positional understanding of the game. We start off a video with this position where we just quickly glance a bit. It might seem like black is on the position to draw this game if he can actually proceed carefully. After all, the rook is actually placed slightly misplaced. Can't really move to the dark squares here in g7, also on h8. The king is on the center of the board, very vulnerable to attacks, and also the queen, major pieces and also the minor pieces here is not really coordinating very nicely to attack the king on the queen side right here. Well, if you look at the white army, the major pieces here is poised to attack the weaker square on the board, which is f7 square. Again, bishop here cutting off that diagonal so the rook cannot come back. Also, if you see the rook here is nicely placed on the semi-open file to generate some attacks later on in the game. Now, the only caveat in this position, of course, is that if white plays it a bit more passively, then black will be able to bring and activate the minor pieces onto the center of the board and perhaps try to trade off some of the pieces, rendering white's advantage to slide off, and perhaps will be able to steer this position to a draw. At the moment, white is slightly preferred in this position, and Ruslan Ponomariov played black, placed knight to e5 in this position, trying to close down this diagonal a bit and also trying to trade off some pieces. Hikaru Nakamura take off his knight and placed knight to c4, bringing the knight to the center of the board. And theoretically, if you're worse in this position, it is better to keep trading pieces, something like queen to c5, and hope for a better chance to actually draw the game. However, in this position, Ruslan Ponomariov, play something like rook takes on c4, after the pawn takes, queen takes. He's hoping and banking on the fact that the dark squares here is actually very weak, and if the pawn to b3 and bishop to a3, he's able to checkmate white in position. What black probably didn't realize though, is that white still has a lot of counterplay, and is going to be very annoying on the queen side and on the center of the board. Plus, if you look at it, the rook's actually already open on the d file. Nakamura continues the queen to b6, attacking the bishop on v7, and the queen to c6 protecting it, queen to a5 attacking the e5 pawn instead. This is really the counterplay that we talk about for white that can really annoy black to the pits of hell. I mean, black has all this plan to take control over the dark squares, but he's busy defending all the minor pieces and also the pawn that's attacked. In this position, Ruslan Ponomariov plays pawn to f6. But as a viewer, let me ask you to pause the video a bit and really see what is the plan for white to continue over here. After all, the rook's now open on the d file and soon on the f file. The queen is now looking at the d file. Looks like there's a checkmate after all. But still, I'll give you a couple seconds to pause the video to find the move and to find a plan to go to. Now Nakamura in this position plays pawn to h4. If you were to imagine, the rook here now is open against the set. F file is also open, soon to be opened. And so if we were able to land a check somewhere, this would be a checkmate because of course the king cannot move. So this pawn h4 move is just to do that. Ponomariov continues with rook to g7, attacking the pawn on g4, but after bishop to f3, we see rook to g8, trying to get the rook into the game. Not a bad move, but in this position, pawn to g5. Now it's brilliant playing pawn to g5 in this position, again releasing the bishop onto this long diagonal and trying to checkmate black in some position. But on the other hand, black's probably blanking on the fact that if black plays something like pawn takes on g5, white will actually place pawn g5, and after rook g5, probably will have something like rook to h1. Black's position is still worse, but perhaps he has something like king to f7 to protect, the g8 and h8 square. So, something like rook to h8 here, we just rook to g8, and probably he'll be able to defend. However, things are not so simple when Hikaru Nakamura is playing the game. In this position, there are two ways to win the game. One of them is by playing bishop to h5 check, and the other one is what Nakamura play, and he plays queen takes on e5, sacrificing the queen seemingly, but the point is after pawn takes, there will be bishop to h5, and this will be a tremendous checkmate on the center of the board. As you can see, the king cannot move to the e file and also the the f file, and the only way to protect that is rook to g6, but this is checkmate. And so, the move queen to e5 might not be the sexiest move you can find in chess history, but still, if you find it, you're probably on the course of winning. Now in this position, Ruslan Ponomariov did not take the queen, placed king f7, but after this position, After they move queen to c5, which is a blunder in this position, Hikaru Nakamura release, bishop takes on e6, with the obvious intention after the king takes queen g8, and after the king moves to f8, of course, queen to g8, that's also checkmate. And so in this position, Rustam Ponomarev just resigned. Truly amazing for white to place queen takes on e5, sacrificing the queen on the center of the board. And it's not the one that is usually seen on the top level play anyway. And so if there's any pattern that we can see, probably it's the fact that white has to be very active if you want to do sacrifice. If you look at this position, white's position is actually poised to give black some trouble after all. And the knight is going to the center of the board, the bishop is cutting through and looking at the king's side. This bishop here on g2 looking at the queen's side. And so probably if that's the first cue that we can take, is the fact that we have to activate all our pieces. The rook as well here is taking control of the escape square. And so yeah, perhaps that's the first cue that we can take. Now the second game was when Hikaru Nakamura was up against Enviel, and Enviel in this position placed Benoni defense and Benoni gambit the pawn to b5. The idea is that if white takes the pawn on b5, then this pawn will be left weak and lonely. More often than not, black also plays pawn to a6, so that if pawn takes on a6, bishop takes on a6, that's bishop takes on a6, then there'll be two pieces developed, while white has none being developed at the moment. So white doesn't take that one, he plays pawn to f3 and pawn to e4. However, after pawn takes d5, normal move is pawn takes d5. Hikaru Nakamura did not go for normal though, plays pawn to e5 in this position. After queen to e7, queen to e2, knight g8, we do see sort of a big center for for black in this position, pawn to d5 and pawn to c4. And so after queen to c5 in this position, I encourage everybody to actually pause this video to actually see if there's any move that actually can control and destroy the center pawn here on d5 and c4. I'll give you a couple of seconds. Now bravo if you find it, but the move here is knight takes on d5, sacrificing around the center of the board. Idea of course, if that the queen cannot take, then obviously the bishop can take on d5. The continuation for white is that Nakamura can place bishop to e3. This is truly amazing idea. Of course, because after queen back to somewhere else, there is no protecting the bishop, then knight to d5, winning a piece back, also just up a pawn at the moment. Pawn takes b5 results in knight to b6 as well, so this is nothing good for black. Black still have a couple of tricks on the sleeves though. He plays queen to b4, spinning the knight to the king so the knight cannot move. But Nakamura here plays pawn to a3, attacking the queen. After the queen moves to a5, still keeping the pin on the knight, we see bishop to d2. Now some chances to bring the bishop back, and if the bishop is not brought back somewhere else, then it'll be truly hanging. So bishop back to e6, and after knight to d5 anyway, attacking the queen, queen back to d8, we do see queen to c4. Idea is clear now, the knight can come to c7, gives a check, and also fork the rook and the king. Ideally, black is to capture the knight on d5, and after queen to d5 everything is fine. However, as you can see here, everything is not fine, because every piece is on the back rank, and the queen here is attacking f7, and also a8 rook on the corner of the board. And so this is not right. After rook moves to a7, we can have bishop to c4 attacking the f7 square once again. Queen of course can come to e7 to protect the f7 square. However, in this position already, we play pawn to b6, and this is tremendous pressure for black. Probably already very worse and on the way to losing, as he has no square for the rook, and everywhere he goes, we just capture. So preemptively, Maxim Vachier-Lagrave moves the rook to a7, also protecting c7 square a little bit from the fork that the knight can come to. However, in this position, rook to c1, developing a piece, also in the fact we can just bring the rook and the queen down to the c-file, checkmate black that way. Now in this position, it's probably more correct to play bishop takes on d5, and the queen to d5, we can develop our pieces anyhow we want, but of course it's just going to be difficult. But in this position anyway, black did not play that, and he plays pawn takes on d5. Probably thinking that a pawn taking on d5 and hence attacking on c4 is a big threat to white that white has to handle. However, white doesn't have to care and plays knight to c7, laughing in the face of danger. But here we have a check that we can handle. The rook has to take, and of course obviously if the king were to move to e7 by the way, then we have the yabai, bishop to b4 check, where he probably has to sacrifice the queen, and this is still a check, we can get out safely. No good for black if that happens. Instead, knight to c7 check, rook takes, and after the queen takes, knight to c6, encouraging the queen trade, and of course white takes it because of the bishop to b5. Now suddenly he's just up a couple of pawns to the queen side that he can push onto the journey and become a queen. And now Maxim Vachier-Lagrave again plays a serious blunder in attempt to take the pawn back, but playing knight to e5. Now knight to e5 is a serious blunder because it allows bishop to a5 check. Earlier on, it was not possible for bishop come to a5 because knight is hitting here on c6. But now, bishop to a5 is a serious threat because after king to e7, rook to c8, and suddenly we can toss away the idea of black developing on the king side. Everyone is stuck here on the king side, and it's just going to be the kaput for black. Black plays pawn to f5, trying to bring the knight to f6 maybe and try to develop g6 and bishop g7. But obviously this is going to be very difficult for black, because after bishop to b4 check, d6, Hikaru Nakamura plays rook takes on f8. This is an ending, a nail in the coffins, if you will. And after king to f8, bishop to d6, and bishop to e5, this is winning the second pawn. And in this position, I won't have to continue too far to actually say that black has all the advantage on the board. And in this position, Maxim Vachier just resigned. So it's amazing how you can get into this position, a completely winning position, from this position, by playing sacrifice that can actually destroy the center pawn, and in the end give you some counterplay and extra space on the board. So the third game that we have is from Vitaly Tseshovsky, and in this position he plays bishop to f5. As you can see, white is in a bit of tight position. Of course he has to protect the knight, but after, let's say, bishop takes on d3, queen takes d3, the rook will be hanging on a4. And so in this position, something has to protect the knight, right? So white plays rook fd1. That seems like normal, protecting the knight, so he can protect the knight on a4 as well. However, when Vitaly Tseshovsky plays this position, it makes it look like a blunder. In this position, black plays rook takes on e3. This seems crazy, first of all, because it's a blunder, because of the pawn takes, knight takes, it looks like nothing, but bishop takes d4. Suddenly you can see that the rook sacrifice gets you a 3 pawns in the center of the board. And also after king to h1, we have queen to h4. Suddenly everyone is on the king side, attacking the pawn. Now white here plays knight to c5, probably trying to trade off some pieces on the king side, and also protecting the knight on a4. But this is too late. Queen to f2, attacking the pawn on g2 with mate. Rook to g1 protected. But now comes bishop to h3 again. Sexy killer move. The thing is, after the pawn takes on h3, this is a checkmate. Instead, if white plays something like rook to c2 to challenge and also to protect g2 square, then knight to c2, queen to c2, queen to g1, this is also checkmate. So checkmate, left and right. So white tries queen takes e3, but this is losing a queen, and in the end of the day, this position is not worth to say because it's just winning for black. The engine gives queen to d1 as an equal move for white, but here, black can also find rook takes on e3 as the best move. With the same idea, after pawn takes on e3, knight takes e3, the queen is attacked, and after that, it's the same continuation that we saw earlier, with the knight being lost on a4. So not harbor too much on this position, but as you can see, every one of this sacrifice is not really common day-to-day life, and so it really depends on calculation and position understanding. The last position that we'll be visiting today is between Fabiano and Magnus Carlsen from the Tata Steel 2022, and as you can see, Fabiano is a huge center of the board, and also has the space. But in the exchange, the minor pieces ain't doing nothing too much for now. Black, as Magnus Carlsen plays bishop to c6, attacking the knight on f3, and after rook to b1, of course because the rook is semi-open on the b-file, it would be nice to bring it to b-file to attack the queen. Magnus Carlsen plays pawn to a4. Now it's important to see that bishop to f3 is actually losing, because of the queen to e6 and queen to b3. Even after you exchange the queen off, the pressure comes to b7 pawn, and after rook to a1, these 2 pawns on the queen side will be lost, and it will be nice for white to have. This will be advantageous. So bishop takes f3 is actually a blunder, a mistake from white. In this position though, Magnus Carlsen plays pawn to a4, protecting the pawn under the protection of the bishop, but after rook to c1 and rook to d8. In this position though, again, I still feel that Fabiano is better off to play rook to b6, because the queen to a8, he'll waste time to bring the queen onto the game, queen to c8. Instead, what Fabiano plays is an inviting move, is knight to d2. The problem with this move is that black plays queen to e2, entering the position. In this position again, white could have chosen to play knight to f3, closer on that diagonal. Bishop takes f3 is not a win, because of course, rook to e1, queen to c2, and pawn takes f3, it's not win a pawn for black. Position will be fine for white to go to. However, in this position again, white just plays pawn to f3. Another mistake, I guess, from Fabiano, because in this position, black plays rook takes on d4, sacrificing the rook for an exchange, but after that takes on d2. The queen takes on d2, winning a knight. It will not be possible if the knight were to be moved to f3. Now after rook to d1, queen f4, black's on way to take the pawn on e5, and to win the second pawn and have a good position. This position is already winning for black. Fabiano caruana plays queen to b4, trying to exchange off the queen, but black is more than happy to exchange queens in a better position, and after bishop takes on e5, white continues with bishop to a3, but as you can see, this position is already crap for black. Black just proves it by first consolidating every pieces and bringing all the piece on the king's side, where he can exchange it off for something that is more valuable in defending the position for white. In this case, it's going to be a pair of rooks. So after rook to f3, rook takes f3, pawn takes f3. As we can see, all pawns protected by a light squared bishop here for black, and black can just really march up the king and take up the pawn here on c5 that is weak. And suddenly he'll be up 3 pawns for an exchange, and he'll be able to win the game. In this position, after king to f1 and bishop to d4, with a clear intention to attack the pawn on c5, white just resigns. Now white could have tried something like rook to b4, where after bishop takes c5, rook to f4 check. This is discovery, and this would be a blunder for black, awkward blunder, that is. But black is Magnus Carlsen, not some wulu grandmaster. So yeah, I probably won't blunder that. After rook b4, I suppose something like bishop to e3, or something like bishop to e5 to control the square from checks. And so yeah, I think in this position, it's very clear to see why Magnus Carlsen is actually winning. The pawn here also on f2, trying to promote. The pawn here on c5 going to lose his life the next few turns. And this pawn on the queen side ready to push forward to become a queen as well. And so in this position, Fabiano caruana just resigned. And so this is generally the theme that I want to show you today, is the fact that you can sacrifice a piece for your center pawn in order to get some activity for pieces and heck even win the game in a cool fashion. Alright, that's the video for today. If you really enjoy it, if you learned something in this video, I'd appreciate it a lot if you can press the like button. And otherwise, I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.